Thank you. Our text for this morning is the whole chapter of Zechariah chapter 2. It concerns the third vision, night vision that Zechariah had. We've already looked at the first two. We'll review them briefly before we look at the text. We'll begin by reading the text, Zechariah chapter 2, verses 1 through 13. Chapter 2, verse 1. Zechariah is speaking. I lifted up mine eyes again and looked, and behold, a man with a measuring line in his hand. Then said I, Whither goest thou? And he said unto me, To measure Jerusalem, that I may see what is the breadth thereof, and what is the length thereof. And behold, the angel that talked with me went forth, and another angel went out to meet him. And he said unto him, Run, speak to this young man, and say, Jerusalem shall be inhabited without walls, for the multitude of men and cattle therein. For I, saith the Lord, will be unto her a wall of fire round about her, and will be the glory in the midst of her. Ho, ho, come forth, and flee from the land of the north, saith the Lord. For I have scattered you into the four winds of the heavens, saith the Lord. Save thyself, O Zion, that dwellest with the daughter of Babel. For thus saith the Lord of hosts, After this glory hath he sent me unto the nations, which spoiled you. For he that toucheth you toucheth the apple of his eye. For behold, I will lift up mine hand upon them, and they shall be a spoil to those that serve them, and ye shall know that the Lord of hosts has sent me. Rejoice and be glad, O daughter Zion, for lo, I come and will dwell in the midst of thee, saith the Lord. And many nations shall be joined to the Lord in that day, and shall be my people. And I will dwell in the midst of thee, and thou shalt know that the Lord of hosts has sent me unto thee. And the Lord shall inherit Judah his portion in the Holy Land, and shall choose Jerusalem again. Let all flesh be still before the Lord, for he is raised up out of his holy place. Title of our message this morning, Zechariah chapter 2, verses 1 to 13. The third vision of Zechariah, the work of the coming Messiah. In the first chapter of Zechariah, we read of the first two of 8 dream visions. In these visions, God promises to bring Israel, which is the church, into a golden age of peace and prosperity. The first vision concerned Christ arriving as an angel to survey the spiritual landscape of the heathen nations. 3 other angels reported that the godless nations were at rest while the church remained under captivity and opposed on every side. This vision was given to show that God was now going to change the condition of the church, and the church would now have a time of peace and prosperity in the land of Jerusalem. The second vision told of 4 carpenters or blacksmiths that would destroy the 4 world empires that would enslave the Jews, which are Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. This second vision explained how God would subdue the enemies of Israel to make this golden age possible. So now we come to the third vision. There are 3 points to our message this morning, verses 1 to 5. Christ measures Jerusalem in preparation of its coming prosperity. Verses 6 to 9, the people warned to leave Babylon before its fall. And verses 10 to 13, the Jews will stumble at the coming Messiah, but will be restored in the millennial reign. We'll see that very clearly. Context. Here in this text we have the third of 8 dream visions. All 8 of these visions came to Zechariah in just one night. In this vision we read of multiple promises which include an increase of exiles returning to Israel, and a coming of a prosperous time for the church, which was immediately fulfilled. The rebuilding of the second temple, which will be fulfilled within the next 200 years. The promise of the coming Messiah, which will be fulfilled within the next 400 plus years. And the future millennial reign of Christ, which was at least 2,000 years away. This passage also contains a very specific prophecy that teaches that Christ will come to earth as a man and literally dwell amongst the church. In the first 2 visions, God promised a prosperous Jerusalem. In this third vision, we will see how this is to be accomplished. We come to our first point, verses 1 to 5. Christ measures Jerusalem, or the church, in preparation of its coming prosperity. Verse 1. Zechariah is speaking. He says this, I lifted up mine eyes again and looked, and behold, a man with a measuring line in his hand. Now Zechariah had already seen 2 visions that night and probably expected no more. But to his surprise, the 3rd vision now appears before his eyes. Here he sees the vision of a man who is once again the Christ, and he has a measuring line in his hand. This is the 2nd vision in which Christ has appeared as a man, which is of course looking forward to when the Son of God would become the Son of Man in human form. In this vision, the God-man is a master builder without limitation. He surveys the land in preparation for the great building projects that God has foretold will soon begin in the city of Jerusalem, both physically for the city and spiritually for the church we're talking. Christ measures the church and the city of Jerusalem, and he finds them both lacking. Christ will determine that it needs to be rebuilt and repaired, the church inside and out. This vision promises a brighter future for the now desolate remains of the temple, which Ezra will come to fix and will be enlarged, and the walls, which Nehemiah will come to fix that now surround Jerusalem. Verse 2. Then said I, says Zechariah, to Christ, Whither goest thou? And he said unto me, To measure Jerusalem, that I may see what is the breadth thereof and what is the length thereof. In other words, I'm going to measure the state of the church. Zechariah asks Christ, who is here in the form of a man holding a measuring line, what are you going to do, and what are you doing with that measuring line? We might call it a tape measure. Christ says that he is taking account or measuring Jerusalem, which refers, of course, specifically to the church. This measuring, by the way, is a similar vision to that as in Revelation chapter 11, verse 1 and 2. Where an angel also had a measuring tape and was taking account of the condition of the church, you might remember. The difference between the 2 visions is that in this verse, Christ is measuring the oppression of the real Babylon, and in Revelation chapter 11 and 2, the angel will be measuring the oppression of mystic Babylon, which is the papacy. The measurements concern the physical dimensions of the actual temple that will be enlarged, meaning the actual people of the church will be enlarged. The number of Jewish exiles that will soon return will also be enlarged, as well as the community of Jews that will soon take over the whole city of Jerusalem. Verse 3 and 4. And behold, the angel that talked with me went forth, and another angel went out to meet him, and said unto him, Run, speak to this young man, the young man is Zechariah, and say, Jerusalem shall be inhabited without walls, for the multitude of men and cattle therein. So we're told here now that one angel, who is Christ, commands another angel to go back and tell the young man, Zechariah, that Jerusalem shall be inhabited without walls, for the multitude of men and cattle therein. This is here what we call a triple fulfillment prophecy. First, the prophecy was immediately and literally fulfilled because many exiles over the next 200 years would return to Jerusalem, so much so that the walls of Jerusalem could hardly contain all the Jewish returning exiles. So we have a prophecy here of the walls of Jerusalem needing to be enlarged because of all the inhabitants of it. But of course the walls of Jerusalem are also the walls around the church. So first it's immediately fulfilled with all the exiles come back, and Jerusalem, the city, can hardly contain all the returning exiles. That's the first fulfillment of the expanding walls of the church. Secondly, this prophecy would be fulfilled by the work of the coming Christ. Notice the text is teaching that the church will no longer be contained simply within the walls of Jerusalem. It's going to go beyond Israel. Jerusalem, the church, is now going to become a church without walls. In other words, the Old Testament dispensation of the gospel of grace that only went to the Jews will now be replaced by the New Testament dispensation of the gospel of grace, and all nations will receive the gospel. So this is a time that referred to as the fullness of the Gentiles. This, of course, will occur when Christ comes and the gospel is introduced to all the lands. But this gospel will be, of course, largely rejected due to the reign of Antichrist. There will be believers in every nation, but the nations will largely refuse to acknowledge Christ as king. The devil, of course, will still be the prince of the world and rule the world through the Antichrist. So we see the second fulfillment of it. Now the third fulfillment of that prophecy. After, of course, the reign of Antichrist is complete, we will have the third and greater fulfillment of the prophecy of an ever-expanding church here. Once the devil is confined to the bottomless pit for 1,000 years, then the kingdoms of the world will become the kingdoms of Christ. The gospel will go out from Jerusalem and cover the land as the waters cover the sea. This is a prophecy of not only Gentile inclusion in the gospel, but also of the future overwhelming inhabitants of the earth that will confess the gospel during the millennial reign of Christ. So we see a triple fulfillment. The church will expand. When the exiles return, it'll expand to the nations when Christ returns, but it will expand even greater when all nations nationally covenant. And we'll come to a verse in a moment that explains that all nations will nationally covenant. Verse 5. For I, saith the Lord, will be under her a wall of fire round about her, and will be the glory in the midst of her. Again we see that this angel is Christ, for he calls himself Lord, or Jehovah. No ministering angel could make such a promise of being a Lord. God will fulfill his promises to expand the church, we're told, by being a wall of fire round about it. Now, a wall of fire, if you're in a war, cannot be scaled like a block wall. You can't run through a wall of fire. You can't even see through a wall of fire to shoot at those who are behind it. So it's the perfect weapon in battle. In other words, God is going to be a future impenetrable wall of protection for his church. Now, a wall of fire, of course, was a common image to the Jews. In Exodus 14, 19, and 24, the wall of fire was called a pillar of fire. And it was used to bring the Jews out of Egypt and to give them protection from all enemies without. Likewise, God will show his glory in this wall of fire to the church, just as God's glory was contained in the pillar of fire during the Exodus. This language, of course, was common to the Jews and was an assurance of protection seen in times past. God will be a wall of fire in an immediate sense for the returning exiles. We come to our second point, verses 6 to 9. The people warned to leave Babylon before its fall. Verse 6 says this. Ho, ho, come forth and flee from the land of the north, saith the Lord, for I have scattered you into the four winds of the heavens, saith ye Lord. Since God has now promised Jerusalem that it will be safe, rich, and receive the presence of God once again, all the exiles are now being encouraged to return from Babylon to Jerusalem. Only about 50,000 exiles so far had returned to Jerusalem. Now the rest are encouraged to return from, quote, the land of the north, which is Babylon. Now remember, although some Jews were under Persian rule and the Persians had conquered a lot of portions of Babylon, there were still Jews that were under Babylonian rule. So some Jews are under Persian rule at this time, some Jews are under Babylonian rule. The Persians hadn't completely conquered the Babylonians yet. That's why he's telling them to return from Babylon. Okay? God reminds them that it was his purpose to punish them, the Jews, for their idolatry by scattering them by the four winds of heaven. He says, you're in exile because I put you there because of idolatry. Which explains why God had been so cold to them for the last 70 years. However, God is saying that will now change. Just as God had once promised to scatter them if they would not refrain from the sin of idolatry, he now promises to gather them and allow them to safely return under his protection of fire. Verse 7. So now God says to them, save thyself, O Zion, from Babylon, that dwellest with the daughter of Babel, or Babel. We notice that the Jews might be reluctant to return to Jerusalem. Here we see God commanding them to return. I guess he fears that they might not want to. It should be understood that the Jews had homes in Babylon, and many of them had lived in Babylon their whole lives. Many were living comfortably and had become complacent or even prospered in Babylon. But Babylon, of course, was destined to be punished by God. The Jews should have known that Babylon was not to be their permanent home. They should have never treated it as such. The Jews should have known, they're reminded by Zechariah that they are not children of Babylon, but they are daughters of Zion. And daughters of Zion should dwell in Zion. Zion means Jerusalem. Daughters of Zion do not live among or worship idols like the Babylonians. They worship Jehovah. So they should return to Jerusalem where Jehovah is worshipped. The Jews, of course, had already been warned of the coming destruction of Babylon, especially in Ezekiel 5:12 and Jeremiah 4:11, which means the Jews should vacate Babylon before that unknown punishment time comes. They are to come out of Babylon and, of course, be separate. Judgment is coming, and it is certain on Babylon. They should not think that they can avoid that judgment if they remain in Babylon. They must return to Israel for safety. Verse 8, "For thus saith the Lord of hosts, After this glory hath he sent me unto the nations which spoil you, for he that toucheth you toucheth the apple of his eye." In other words, it's you who I love. I'm going to destroy these lands that oppose you, so get out of the way. This continues to be a message from Christ to the church. It is another encouragement for the Jews to return. Christ intends to make the Jewish nation a glory among all nations. God intends to take very good care of them. In fact, he intends to save them, send them his very Son. When God says that he regards Israel as the apple of his eye, it refers to the fact that the church is the focal point of Christ's interaction with man. In other words, all historical events, man, if Christian schools could only learn to teach history this way, all historical events will be judged in their relationship to the church. Everything that happens in history does for the benefit of the church. You can't understand a single thing that happens in history except you try to figure out what God is trying to benefit the church for that reason. Every event in history will be designed to have its desired effect upon the church. God views history through the eyes of his church, and so should we. If the church is the apple of God's eye, anyone who disturbs the church is said to poke God in the eye. This warning should make all nations greatly desire to make peace with the church so as not to invoke the wrath of God. Don't mess with his church. You don't mess with the king's children. Verse 9. "For behold, I will lift up mine hand upon them, and they shall be a spoil to those that serve them, and ye shall know that the Lord of hosts has sent me." In other words, I'm about to destroy anybody who affects my church. Here we have the repetition of the threat against God's judgment upon Babylon. God goes further than encouraging them to leave Babylon. He requires it. God says that he intends to spoil or do violence to the nations that oppose his church. This refers especially to those who conquered and held captive the church. Both the Jews and the heathen nations will see this promise come to pass. Christ says the Father has commissioned him to inform them that God intends to destroy these heathen nations. Come to our final verses, verses 10 to 13, our final point. The Jews will stumble at the coming Messiah, but will be restored in the millennium reign. Verse 10, we'll see this very clearly. Verse 10, "Rejoice and be glad, O daughter Zion, for lo I come and will dwell in the midst of thee, saith the Lord." All that are invited to return are also called upon here to sing and rejoice. Furthermore, when the exiles return from their deliverance from Babylon, Christ is also going to return to them. This is not written just to the exiles, but to all Jews. The whole nation of Zion. They had been in captivity for 70 years to teach them not to forsake reform. Now they're being invited to reform themselves because God is prepared to reveal himself to those who are obedient and reformed. Again, here we have a double fulfillment prophecy. First, Christ is going to dwell with them in spirit as he restrains their enemies and helps them to prosper as they rebuild the temple. So there'll be an immediate fulfillment. Secondly, when Christ says, "I come and will dwell in the midst of thee," he is also talking about his future incarnation, when Christ will live among them in the flesh 500 years later. Christ is telling them that he will appear physically among them as the Son of Man. Verse 11. "And many nations," check these words out, "and many nations shall be joined to the Lord in that day, and shall be my people, and I will dwell in the midst of thee, and thou shalt know that the Lord of hosts has sent me unto thee." Again, this verse has a triple fulfillment. An immediate fulfillment for the Jews at that time, a fulfillment when Christ comes, and a fulfillment in the millennial. And you cannot understand this verse unless you see all three fulfillments. Here's the first fulfillment. The verse teaches that a time will come when the Jews will rejoice and prosper, and even the Gentiles will begin to seek the Lord. Now this was first literally fulfilled in the days of Esther, as in Esther chapter 8:17, where it says this, "And in every province and in every city, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree come, the Jews had joy and gladness and feast and a good day. And many of the people of the land became Jews, for the fear of the Jews fell upon them." So, during the days of Esther, Ezra, and Nehemiah, God did return and has allowed his Spirit to dwell among the Jews, and they did prosper greatly, and some Gentiles came in, not many, but some did. So we see that these words were fulfilled in the 450 years before the coming of Christ, in the days of Esther. But this prophecy also speaks of a time when many nations or Gentile nations shall be joined to the Lord. This, of course, was not fulfilled in the days of Zechariah or in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah, but was fulfilled only in the days of Christ. So we see there has to be a second fulfillment here. This verse tells us about the days following Pentecost, when the fullness of the Gentiles would begin. In those days, the Gentiles would also begin to turn to Christ. The covenant of grace here will be extended beyond the walls of Jerusalem, and even the heathen will love, fear, worship, and obey Christ. The promise, of course, goes beyond the building of the second temple, and it goes to all nations. So when Christ comes, that will be the beginning of when all nations begin to come to the Lord. So Christ's coming is the second fulfillment. But notice this. There's a third fulfillment, and listen to the language. That many nations shall be joined to the Lord that day. The reader must ask itself, how is a nation joined to the Lord? And when will nations be joined to the Lord? A nation is only joined to the Lord when it confesses Christ as its king and allows the law of its king to govern its nation. Israel, of course, has never confessed Christ as king, and very few countries have right now. Therefore, this verse clearly points to some future time when the majority in all the nations will be joined, and by joined we're talking about a national covenant to the Lord. When that time comes, the Lord will dwell in the midst of his people like never before, because his presence will be most welcome, and he will be most inclined to dwell among his reformed and faithful people. Now this verse has one interesting clause. It says, "And thou shalt know that the Lord of hosts has sent me unto thee." Who, we might ask, is thou that will know spoken of in this verse? It's Israel. This and the next verse is going to explain how Israel is going to come in. It is Israel, and when will Israel know as a nation and confess as a nation that Jesus is a Messiah? Well, of course, they didn't know it when Christ came. They've not known it 2018 years later, and they certainly don't know it now. This prophecy is speaking of a time when the Jews will return to the covenant of their forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and confess the Messiah whom they killed. This is a promise that one day the Jews will reverse their idolatry and embrace Christ as the Messiah as he revealed himself to them long ago. They will join themselves to Christ by a national covenant. And listen to this, verse 12. Here's the clear verse. "And the Lord shall inherit Judah his portion in the Holy Land, and shall choose Jerusalem again." He chose him once. He's going to choose him again. This verse describes the days after Jerusalem covenants with their Messiah, have a national covenant. We notice these events described in this verse cannot possibly be linked to the days of Ezra and Nehemiah, because it talks about a falling away and the need to be chosen again. We also know that the Jews stumbled at the coming of Messiah and that they have not yet recovered to be chosen again. They were once a chosen people, but are, of course, in a state where they need to be chosen again. After the fall of the Antichrist, the Jews will be provoked by God's love for the Gentile nations and will eventually desire to return to the presence of God. That's exactly what we see, by the way, in Romans 11:11, where it says this, "I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall or fall permanently? God forbid, but rather through their fall salvation is coming to the Gentiles, for to provoke them to jealousy." The Jews may have rejected the Messiah for a long time, but we're told the day will come when God again will choose Jerusalem. Now we know that God has not yet chosen Jerusalem yet to be the seat of his glory, but here it is prophesied that the day will come, just as we read in Romans 11:25. For I would not, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery, lest you should be wise in your own conceits. That blindness in part is happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. In other words, God will give it to the Gentiles first what he offered to the Jews first, but eventually the Jews will be changed by the Spirit of God and they will be chosen again. Verse 13, let all flesh be still before the Lord, for he is raised up out of his holy place. Lastly, we read of a warning. All flesh is commanded to be silent because some may doubt the promises of Christ mentioned in this dream prophecy. Some Jews may have been so long in captivity that they thought this kind of deliverance could never happen. But neither Jew nor Gentile have any say in the future plans of God. Man is short-sighted, he's perishing, and he's unwise. God is wise and faithful to his promises. God will raise men to accomplish his great plans. God will cause empires to fall, nations to covenant, and man need do nothing more than be silent and wait. This future has been decreed from out of his holy place, meaning heaven. Man ought not to dispute these words. He ought to deny them, ignore them, or grow impatient with their fulfillment of them, because God has spoken and his words are final. Man has no need to stir until all things have been accomplished according to God's timing. When God begins to act, we're looking forward to that fall of the papacy, the recalling of Israel, the covenanting of all nations, and the millennial reign of Christ. Then we will know that he is raised up out of his holy place and prepared to accomplish all his will through history. We see that this text had multiple fulfillments to the coming of the Messiah and also to the millennial reign. Let us pray. O Lord our God, when we read the Scriptures, may we know that we're reading the only thing that we can ever look upon on this side of heaven that is perfectly true and is perfectly honest and is perfectly giving us the will of God. And we have set before us the future history of the world, some things having already happened, like the coming of Christ, some things yet to happen, like the conversion of the Jews and the covenanting of all nations, that time when all nations will be joined unto thee. But we are to treat these things as if they've already happened. For as you speak that they will happen, they have happened. For it is impossible that they should not happen. And may we be silent and wait for your presence to work its way through history. We do pray these things in thy Son's name. Amen. Conclude our worship now with the singing of Psalm 91. Remember, 70,000 people are going to die because of David's census taking. He's going to purge the church. But he promises here in the final verses, 13 through 16, which we'll sing to the tune of French, that the righteous man during this purge will be untroubled, he'll be delivered, he'll be honored, he'll be granted long life while all those are perishing around him, and he'll be granted eternal life. Verses 13 to 16 to the tune of French. Adder thou shalt tread, and on the lion strong. Thy feet on dragons trample shall, and on the lions young. Because on me he set his love, I'll save and set him free. Because my great name he hath known, I will him set on high. He'll call on me, I'll answer him, I will be with him still. In trouble to deliver him, and honor him I will. Lengths of days unto his mind, I will him satisfy. I also my salvation will cause his eyes to see. Now the Lord of peace himself give you peace always by all means. The Lord be with you all. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you all. Amen.